So fat, we're on my real home turf now because this was my PhD. So my PhD was an examination of the 2 dietary fat guidelines that were introduced in, in the US in the late 70s. And then, of course, the rest of the world followed. So the UK followed in 1983. Don't know exactly when Australia, New Zealand, Europe and all the rest of it followed, but, you know, most countries followed the sort of the early work of the Senator McGovern Committee around 1977. And then, of course, that got embedded in the dietary guidelines for Americans in 1980, which have then got just sort of repeated every 5 years. Excuse me, it's quite...
No, you're...
It's dry in our room because it's so cold here. We're in the middle of winter and I've got layers on and big woolly jumper. Right, that's
I know what it's like.
So, dietary fat. First really important thing to get in your head. So everybody picture a little circle in front of you, a little sort of pie-shaped circle, and a nutritional fact, and I can give you empirical evidence for this, I can give you theoretical evidence for this, but it's just a nutritional fact, trust me, that in any natural diet, and it actually goes for vegetarian diets as well as omnivore diets, protein tends to be about 15 to 20% of your calorie intake. It just does. With carnivores or whatever, it can go higher, but in carnivores such as yourself who are doing sensible things and not having, you know, skinless chicken breasts and protein shakes and all that kind of nonsense, it's fat that sort of takes up the slack. So you've got your little pie in front of you, you've drawn a little 15% segment, and that's your protein. So the minute you then introduce what they did introduce, which was a total fat dietary guideline of 30%, you can see that you've got 55% of your circle left. And there's only one thing left that we can eat, and that is carbohydrate. So the introduction of the low fat, the 30% fat requirement, was immediately and concomitantly an instruction to consume at least 55% of your diet in the form of carbohydrate. And when we did that, we didn't know if that was safe. We didn't know if it was healthy. We did not know anything about that requirement. We just decided that fat was bad. And the background to that is the Ansel Keys work, the 7 countries study. Goes right back to Russian pathologists at the beginning of the 20th century. If you want to read the backstory, it's in chapter 2 of my PhD, which is the review of the literature that got us to this sort of dietary fat place. So my PhD basically said, right, let me pretend that I am the Dietary Guidelines Committee. The time is 1977, and I'm looking at both the randomized controlled trial evidence, so actual intervention trials where they try to mess around with the fat intake of guinea pigs, human people guinea pigs. So I'm going to look at all of that first, and then I'm going to look at the population study. So that would be things like Framingham, the 7 countries study, Minnesota coronary survey that came along a little bit after the, that was around sort of 1983. I'm going to look at both of those separately, and then I'm going to use this statistical technique called systematic review and meta-analysis. Systematic review means I'm going to look at absolutely all evidence available. I'm not going to cherry pick. I'm not going to try and bias the results in any way. I'm just going to get all the evidence. And then the second part of that is meta-analysis, which is just pooling together all of that evidence in a statistical technique. And then it will pop out with a, this is the sum total of the evidence, and what does it tell us? And those first 2 parts of my PhD were done back at the time. So it was essentially asking the research question, should the dietary guidelines have been introduced? And of course, there were 2 dietary guidelines. One was the total fat intake should be no more than 30%. And then it also says your saturated fat intake should be no more than 10% of your calories. And the evidence at the time, to cut the story short, was there was no evidence for either dietary guideline, no evidence whatsoever. Not from randomized controlled trials, not from population studies. The randomized controlled trials, which was the first paper that came out from my PhD, and it literally went viral. I mean, it was covered in New Zealand, Morning Herald, Sydney, whatever, Time Magazine, America, UK. I did about 30 TV, radio interviews on the day it came out. It just went nuts because it basically said there was no evidence for introducing those dietary guidelines at the time. They should not have been introduced. It then came up with some other things that caught the attention of journalists. Only 2,500 people have been studied in the randomized trials. They were entirely male, so no females had been studied whatsoever. They were all sick. They had already had a heart attack or heart disease. So no healthy people have been studied, no women have been studied. And none of the studies individually, let alone collectively, actually concluded that we should do anything about fat. And in fact, a few of them, the majority of them, I think it was 4 out of the 6, specifically cautioned about their intervention. So one of them said a low-fat diet has no place in the treatment of myocardial infarction, which is heart attack. A couple of them said we're really concerned about the potential toxicity of our interventions. And the intervention, of course, was to put in vegetable oils and to take out animal fats, because animal fats were slightly higher in saturated fat than the vegetable oils. So there was just no evidence at the time. So the second part of my PhD then said, okay, but we're not in 1977, 1983, we're in 2016. That's when I'm doing my PhD. So let's repeat the exercise, because there will be more evidence available now. There's now more trials. There's a massive Women's Health Initiative trial for starters. So suddenly we do have women that we can throw into the melting pot. We've got 10 trials instead of 6. We've got more population studies. So let's pool all of that evidence together. Again, no cherry picking, pool it all together. Is there any more evidence that we should introduce those 2 dietary guidelines now? No, is the answer. Now, the very final part of my PhD was a paper that's very readable. I think it's only got my name on it, so you can put my name in PubMed and find it. And it's something like dietary guidelines have no evidence base, so where do we go from here? And that's the final sort of wrap-up paper. And what that paper does is to say, okay, I did 4 studies, randomized trials at the time and now, and population studies at the time and now. So I've done 4 meta-analyses and systematic reviews, but I'm not the only person to have looked at this by any means. I think there were 6 other teams of researchers, and between us, we had 40 findings. So what I did in that final paper is to say, right, let's just, everyone who's looked at this, let's put them all together. Is there any evidence against total fat whatsoever? And the answer is no. Not one team of research. I know this is just not generally known, is it? Absolutely none whatsoever. And that's not me. That's total agreement across all teams of researchers, even ones that could have been funded by anti-fat institutions. Nothing whatsoever against total fat. Ansel Keys never found anything against total fat. He went into the 7th country study thinking that total fat was the problem. He concluded pretty early on, total fat is not the problem. He then decided that saturated fat might be a problem, but in saturated fat, he was counting things like cakes and ice cream. It's like, well, yeah, there's saturated fat in them, but there's way more sugar and flour and crap and vegetable oils and so on. So the other teams of research, out of these 40 findings, there were only 3 positive findings. One was by the Chowdhury team in 2014, and it found that trans fats were not good. We would all agree on that. Pool all of the teams of researchers and say, do you agree with the Chowdhury finding? Every one of us would have said, yeah, good on you for doing that one. Trans fats are not good. Then the other 2 were from the same team, and one was just a repetition of the other. And they said, we think that there's an association between, let me get this right, saturated fat and cardiovascular disease events. But they also found nothing for deaths, nothing for coronary heart disease, nothing for strokes, nothing for this mortality, nothing for that mortality, nothing for the other, nothing. So they found one thing and they trumpeted this one finding. They didn't trumpet all the other things that were just, we didn't find this. We found no evidence to support this. So they said, listen, so yeah, sorry, go on, Dave.
Sorry, I was just going to say, with the saturated fats linked to heart disease, you know, people have been eating less and less and less saturated fat, and heart disease and first-time heart attacks have been going up and up and up. So there's no, I mean, they can't say, I mean, that's like a reverse correlation there. Yeah. You know, yeah. So they really cannot say that this is caused by saturated fat. Yeah. And especially can't link that to red meat, as red meat is actually extremely low in saturated fat. Yeah.
I mean, that's absolutely right. So the 2 findings that came from this one research team, when they were subject to scrutiny, so they had been looking at intervention trials. So let's say the Minnesota Coronary Survey trial was going to replace some eggs and butter with basically margarines and other sort of fake fat products. And they would sort of look at the evidence from some of those trials, but they, in their own paper, and it's a Cochrane paper, so it's like 80 to 90 pages long. In their own paper, when they said, okay, let's do a sensitivity test and let's not look at the trials that said they were going to reduce saturated fat, but the ones that actually did, and what were the findings there? And they found there were no findings. So the same team, if they'd have been honest, you know, if I was quizzing them in some Senate panel and I said, okay, but you've just reiterated this one finding twice, you didn't highlight all the non-findings, you know, do you think that was fair? They've got to say no. And then your own sensitivity test on page 87 or whatever it was found that it all fell away under scrutiny anyway. Would you agree? They'd have to say yes. So we suddenly then have 6, 7, whatever it was, teams of researchers, 40 different findings, and we all agree there's nothing against total fat, there's nothing against saturated fat. But people don't know this. It's like the calorie. It's another one of those urban myths where people say, oh, saturated fat is really bad for you. And it's like, what is saturated fat?
Yeah.
You know, where do you find it? They don't know this stuff.
No, that's right. It's because of the education. It's been so corrupted. You know, the education, the propaganda, everything around us has got us counting calories rather than counting ingredients.
Yeah, or nutrients. We should count nutrients.
Yeah. The biggest thing too, the type of fats, these so-called vegetable oils, which are basically just machine lubricants and whatnot, even if they weren't so rancid, they wouldn't have the nutrients in them to nourish your body anyway, to help your body rebuild or just to stay healthy. Yeah, that's like
that's a really important point, because when you go to the second principle of choose your food for the nutrients it provides, all oils have only got the fat soluble vitamins. That's the only thing that they can possibly contain. They've got no protein, let alone complete protein. They've got no minerals. They just have a couple of the fat soluble vitamins, and it tends to be E and K. So, for example, sunflower oil would be very rich in vitamin E. We'll just have a few sunflower seeds or get your vitamin E from other sources. They don't have vitamin A. They don't have vitamin D. You would just not choose those. So if you looked at them, and that's comparing them nutritionally per 100 grams. So if I'm looking at 100 grams of, let's say, olive oil, which everyone says is some sort of elixir of the Mediterranean. I mean, that's just such bollocks. But look at olive oil, 100 grams versus liver or oil or sardines or something per 100 grams. And then if you want to do it by calories, it's just as bad. So 100 calories of olive oil versus 100 calories of liver. I mean, it's just incomparable. You would never, if you were worried about calories and were choosing your calories carefully to get maximum nutrients, you would never put an oil in your mouth. You would never, oil should be reserved for people. I mean, not even oil. If you're following a keto kind of low carb lifestyle and you need more food, you need more fuel, because you're fueling an active lifestyle and you don't want to lose weight, then you turn to things like butter and lard and beef dripping and natural fat on your meats. You eat a rack of lamb and you choose fatty meats rather than lean meats. I just can't see why you would ever want to consume olive oil or sunflower oil.
Yeah, exactly. And for anyone who doubts this, compared like vegan sort of diet, Dr. Harcombe was actually vegetarian for somewhat 20 years, I believe. Yeah.
Sadly, yeah.
Yeah. So what was the breaking point for you?
That's a good question. So I was at a conference in 2010. It was at a Western Price conference in London, and I heard two excellent speakers. One was Sally Fallon Morell, who's the founder of the Western Price Foundation, and she was talking about nutrients very specifically in kind of similar terms to how I've been talking in this talk. And we're just not taught that stuff at school. So if you'd have said to me at the beginning of the conference, what are vitamins, what are minerals, which ones are they, where are they found, where do they come from? I didn't know any of that. Why are we not taught that at school? That's way more important than, I don't know, some of the stuff that we were taught at school or something, how to appraise something in general studies or whatever. And I remember listening to her, and she was particularly talking about vitamin A. That's something she's really knowledgeable about, and it's why we should consume liver or at least oily fish on a regular basis. And I didn't know that vitamin A came in two forms, and there's the animal form retinol and the plant form carotene. I didn't know that some people are poor converters of carotene to retinol, and I worked out during that presentation that I must be one of them, because at the time I went veggie. Most veggies lapse into veganism at some point. They kind of become a bit unsure about eggs and milk, and oh, you know, really should I, you know, you get some of the sort of more vegan propaganda or whatever. And it was into one of those sort of vegan periods very, very quickly. I mean, we're talking weeks. And I just didn't make the connection at the time. And I started getting some serious eye trouble, a really, really painful eye condition. I ended up in an eye hospital in London. And the first thing they should have said, particularly young female, they should have said, you know, what do you eat? And I doubt they ask people that question nowadays, because they have 7 years of medical school. They have half a day on food and nutrition. And doctors tell me this. Doctors who wake up to our way of thinking, they tell me I had half a day. How was I ever going to know the kind of stuff that you talk about now? So nobody said to me, what are you eating? And actually, look, maybe you can't convert carotene to retinol, retina, eyes, eye health. You're massively deficient in vitamin A. Take a supplement immediately, start consuming oily fish and liver again, and your eyes will be fine in a few days. That's what they should have said to me. But that's not what happened. So I was listening to Sally thinking, oh my goodness, I damaged myself by doing what I did. And I was feeling pretty uncomfortable. And then next presentation was Barry Groves. I then went on to speak at his funeral, bless him. He was an absolute trailblazer in this world. I mean, he was decades ahead of some of the people who were saying stuff now. He was saying that 40 years ago. And he did a presentation called Homo Carnivorous, carnivore man, and he was talking about how the body converts fat and protein, and its need for fat and protein, but not its need for carbohydrate, and why we need to eat meat, and what is it in meat that is so important. And I just messaged I was under the desk, I was sort of messaging my husband saying, I'm coming home non-vegetarian, and he was sort of like, whoa, you know, what shall I buy? It's like, start with steak, we'll take it from there. But I just realized I've been harming myself, and I couldn't do that. And then you get into it more and you realize that it's not best for the planet, it's not best for anything. So I just, then became super aware of the whole vegetarian myth, as Leah Keith so beautifully put it in her fabulous book.